In today's episode, we're going to be hand dipping beeswax candles, including this trident-shaped beeswax candle right in front of me, which we hand dipped last year. This is a traditional Scandinavian design that you will find in the Scandinavian countries around Christmas and New Year's. Traditionally, you would have a branch for each member of your family. So there are some Grenljus that have a lot of branches if you're finding a traditional family that has a lot of kids in it. Since we just have my husband and myself and our cat, we have 3 branches on this one right here. You can actually see this was hand dipped all in one go. And let's go over how we do that in this video. We'll also go over how we hand dip tapers and some of the things that we've done in order to help make the hand dipping process a little bit cheaper. First thing you're going to need, obviously, is beeswax. You can either get it in 1-pound bags like this. These are actually granules in there, you can see, so that makes it a little bit faster for them to dissolve. Or you can get beeswax in blocks right here. We've bought both. It just depends on what was cheaper at the time that we were buying it. And I do like the blocks for starting out because you can get a massive amount going at once, but it does take a little bit longer for them to melt in the solution. And then this, when you're topping off your dipping pot, these will melt a little bit faster. They won't cling to the bottom like these blocks can and get in the way. We're then going to need some wick. So I have some wick left over from last year, and I also have a big spool that we bought this year. This is number 4 wick, 4/0 wick, and you can get it in big spools pretty cheap. The square wick seems to be best for dipping beeswax tapers like we are. And then next we have stearin right here. This is an additive to the wax. This helps the wax burn a little bit slower, helps it be a little bit stronger in candles like this. It also helps give it a slightly glossy appearance. And they claim it helps take the impurities out of the wax. I don't know about that. There's definitely a lot of impurities hanging out at the bottom of our dipper, because I also tend to put in all the old bits of beeswax candles that we've collected over the years. So as we burn the remnants of the candle, we just toss them in a bag and we toss them right into the pot with everything else. You'll then need something to hang your wicks from as you're dipping. I just use a piece of bamboo for most of the tapers, right like that. And then we just tie the wick right on the top and then use something as a weight at the bottom of the wick. I have a box of zinc nuts here from Home Depot. These are just the cheapest ones that they happen to have. And I stick them together with beeswax. There's no need to actually tie the wick onto the nut. What I do is I just melt beeswax between my fingers, grab 2 nuts here out of the box. Once the wax is warm enough, you'll actually be able to squish it around those 2 nuts right there, like you can see right there. And then basically you would just sandwich the wick right there in the middle of these 2 nuts, right like that. Squish it all together and remove the extra wax. We now have a weighted wick right there that will definitely stay at the bottom and keep those tapers nice and vertical as you're dipping them. Now, once the candle reaches a certain size, you would actually just pull those right off the bottom of the wick. That's why I don't tie it on. You might be wondering to yourself, how is it that these nuts don't just slip and slide and fall off themselves? Well, it's because of the thermal mass of these. When you're hand dipping a beeswax candle, it's not in the hot wax very long, so it's not in there long enough to really melt this ball of wax and have the nuts come off. Another way to hand dip tapers is to get a dipping frame right like here. This particular dipping frame dips 28 candles simultaneously, but it is a little bit more wasteful when it comes to the wick, because as you can see on the bottom, the wick actually wraps around the bottom and then around the top of this frame as well. So you're actually using a decent amount more wick than if you were hand dipping the other way. There's also a little bit more cleanup involved because the wax will collect on the metal portions of this frame on the bottom and on the top, and you can't really set this down on something. You can't really put this down on a table once you've dipped because it'll end up sticking to the table, so you do have to hang it. That's why it has this little hook up top. So you dip it and then you hang it and then you let them solidify before you dip again. Now let's get back to this bad boy right here, the trident Grenljus. Let's talk about how to make that. The first thing to do is to get your wick over here. Again, this is 4/0 wick. And then I will tie this wick right here onto the middle of this bamboo. And then we'll pick its size, so we'll say it's right about there or so. Then we have to decide where you want this to branch off. So if we base it off of this particular candle right here, it's going to be about 4 inches or so from the bottom of this main branch right here in the middle. This is the point where the 2 wicks will cross. Now, it is very important that you don't tie the wick onto this wick. You do have to make them actually cross. If you do end up tying there, it'll create a huge blob right here around the middle of the Grenljus, and it really won't look very attractive. It also affects the structural integrity. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a dental pick to put a, not quite a hole, but really sort of stretch out the opening in this wick right there in the middle. So you can see I've actually stabbed the dental pick right there through the middle of the wick, and I'm making that a larger opening, an opening large enough that I could actually thread the wick through. Then, using an embroidery needle that has an eye just big enough that you can actually thread this wick through, you pull it through the hole that we just made in the other wick. Now this is kind of tricky. It is going to require a little bit of fiddling here in order to actually get it completely through. You have to kind of massage it around, and that's why I use the dental pick to really make that that hole there in the weave bigger. So now that we have pulled that through, then we pull the needle off the wick, and you can see that we now have the original wick running here right between my hands, and then we have the wick that was threaded through that hole right here. The next step is to go ahead and tie one side of the wick to the bamboo stick or whatever else you're using to support your candles as you dip them. Tie once, do a double square knot there so that way it's a little sturdier, and then we find the midpoint right like that. As you can see, pull the wick over to the other side, and then attempting to do this in a very even fashion. You actually may be better off marking this bamboo stick so that way you can get it definitely very square there. We then tie the wick here in sort of a Y shape. You can see that we have that center wick right there that is the original, and then we have the wick that we threaded through crossing over right like there. Now you do want a little bit of sag here, so you don't want it to be quite so perfectly Y-shaped. You want it to be a little bit sort of a U shape there, and you can correct that just by adjusting where the knots are located over here. The other thing that you'll need to be aware of is as we start dipping this, you'll actually have to adjust the candle after the first few dips. When it's a little bit smaller than a pencil, you want to lay it down, lay it flat, adjust the curve, then continue dipping. Now let's talk about the setup that we have for wax dipping. It's right here under these blankets. I'm using the blankets to help insulate, help the wax melt a little faster, save energy. This is an electric setup, so what we have going on in here is a large crab boiling pot. You can find these really cheap online. You can also find actual beeswax double boiler designs that are made for this, but I discovered that this is just a cheaper way to go. So we have that crab boiler pot, and then I have a tall pot that I was also able to find online, and this is where the beeswax is. You want to use a double boiler like this because you don't want to overheat the beeswax. If you were to try and put the beeswax directly on a propane stove, for instance, you would end up overheating it. You can actually catch things on fire. You want to get the beeswax to around 190 or so degrees, and that is the optimum dipping point. Keeping the water warm in here is a 1000 watt bucket heater. If you were to use the bucket heater on its own to try and melt the wax initially, I have about 40 pounds of wax in this pot right here. That would take about 6 or 7 hours. You can accelerate things a little bit by getting the water in the pot warm first. So you can heat the water up to just about boiling on a propane stove and then move it out here with the electric unit. And then I have this little digital temperature controller. It actually has a temperature probe that goes right there into the water, and this monitors the temperature and controls that bucket heater because, again, you don't want things to get too hot. This one is good for 10 amps max. Again, I also find this one online. This is a pretty cheap one. And right now the water is 141 degrees and the target is 196. Going in for a closer look, you can see I have this red blanket wrapped around the large pot that again helps insulate. It's also why I have a piece of plywood under the pot, because the patio is brick and it would definitely suck up heat a little bit faster. You can see the immersion heater right there. And if I take a lid off here, you can see this has been heating for about 45 minutes or so, and as you can see, things are starting to get a little bit soft, but definitely it's not melted yet. I can dig my finger in there quite easily and pull off wax, but we're not to the point, obviously, where we could dip. To start things off today, I've added 15 pounds of beeswax. If I need more, I can always add more. I definitely like to keep a lot of beeswax in reserve. At this point, I'm also going to add all those cast-offs from all the other beeswax candles we've used this year. You'll notice some of these were hand-dipped candles, some of these were purple-colored candles. I don't really mind the color going into this because these are not really candles designed for perfection. They're meant to be a little bit rustic. And then we have some actually pure stearin candles right there as well. And speaking of stearin, we want to add the appropriate amount of stearin to go in and augment the beeswax that we're adding to this. Right about there should be fine. If you're not thinking about dipping candles in quite this kind of volume, or if you want to make colored beeswax candles that have a colored shell on them, you can get some dipping molds, put them in a double boiler still right like this, have one with the colors in them, one with the regular wax in them, then you want to dip the candle beginning with the regular wax and then put the last few coats of color on it to have that traditional white center or clear center and then the colored outside. Of course, if you want it to be colored all the way through, you just keep dipping right like that. Now that everything's been added, I'm just going to go ahead and put the lids on top of everything. You notice that the one flaw with this design is that this lid does not sit quite right on there on top, but you can invert that right like that, put that on top, and then it will get a little bit closer. then pop the other blanket right on top to keep it insulated. So as you can see, we've now dipped this several times. You can see the layers really start building up there. Now the one trouble with this frame is that it does end up wasting an awful lot of wax. As we bring it in here to dip it again into the pot, you'll notice that the frame itself ends up holding a lot of wax, as does that central post right there. You just have to keep that in mind. It is definitely an efficient way of really making a lot of very linear candles, but again, that wax quantity is kind of a pain. Overall efficiency isn't too much of a problem except for the quantity of wax consumed, because you do have to keep replenishing it in the pot. As Rob pulls the lid off here, you can definitely see that the level has really gone down quite a bit over the dipping, and so you do have to keep adding more wax in. And in this double boiler method here, the wax doesn't melt quite as quickly as if you were trying to do this over a flame. Meanwhile, our branch candles are coming along quite well. One thing that you'll definitely notice if you're hand dipping these is that you'll get some noticeable shoulders right down here. Kind of looks sort of like, hard to say this in a nice way, but I guess old person shoulders, and the skin starts to droop right there. That's just sort of a normal byproduct of this dipping process here. You can continually trim those as you continue to dip the candle, or you can just leave them, whatever your personal preference is. Once you've reached the desired thickness for the taper, really the bottom section is the most critical part because you want it to be able to fit into a candle holder. You simply cut it off of the rod that you were using to dip it, and then you may want to form the bottom end while it's still a little bit malleable, and then cut it, of course, to make a clean bottom. And there we have it, a Grenljus candle, or a Swedish branch candle, whatever you want to call it. You'll notice again we still have those sort of strong shoulders right there. You can see that it definitely is thinner right down there at the bottom. It's a little bit different than the commercially made candles that you'll see out there. Meanwhile, with one of these frames that makes more than a dozen candles at a time, you simply take a pair of scissors and then you cut at the bottom of the candle, leaving them dangle, and then you can actually extract them in pairs. This allows you to hang the candles up, which is the preferred method of storing a hand-dipped candle like this. Of course, if you have to, you can also lay them on their sides. I would just use some parchment paper to make sure they don't stick together. One of the great things about candle making is that beeswax melts at a relatively low temperature, so all you really need to do to clean things off is boil some water, run it on things, and you'll see that the beeswax just comes right off like that. That also means that this is relatively safe for children, as long as they're old enough to know not to get their hands near it. If they do accidentally get a little bit of beeswax splashed on them in the molten state, as long as you haven't overheated it, they're probably going to be just fine. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. It's been our quick tutorial on candle making. Let me know down there in the comment section below what other videos you would like us to try. And of course, if you have any tips on making hand-dipped candles yourself that you'd like to share with us. I'll see you later.